It was in 1949 that the 15-year-old Gerald Schur first met a mobster. His father was at the time a dressmaker and a member of the UPDMA, the United Popular Dress Manufacturers Association, and his father found it impossible to profit properly as a result of the pressures imposed by the racketeers of the Cosa Nostra, a mafia that made it its mission to intimidate unions, businesses, and officials. And from that day forth, Gerald Schur was determined to fight against and undermine organized crime. 12 years later, then a lawyer living in Texas, he heard the Attorney General of the time, Bobby Kennedy, describe the mob as the equivalent of a private government with an annual income of billions, resting on the base of human suffering and moral corrosion. And Kennedy then stated his intention to fight organized crime by opening a new office and recruiting new prosecutors dedicated to its evisceration. And that day, Schur called the Justice Department and promptly got a job fighting the mob in New York City, where he spent his days interviewing victims and interrogating prisoners and cross-examining witnesses, all in the hopes of working his way up the chain to those bosses holding businesses hostage. But again and again, Gerald Schur hit a brick wall and found victims, prisoners, and witnesses all deeply reticent and hesitant to testify. And with time, he recognized that beyond any loyalty to the bosses or abhorrence for cops, the reluctance stemmed from an unrelenting terror of retribution against them or their families. And it was then that Schur had an epiphany, reached out to his peers in a ministry and pitched the idea for a new government scheme, one often featured in film and in fiction, that could secure the testimony which would ultimately topple the mob. His idea was the Witness Protection Program. And for the next 25 years, from 1971 when it was created, at his instigation, Schur served as the director and superintendent of the program, which has since put more than 20,000 victims, witnesses, criminals, and relatives under their protection, which typically includes their relocation and the adoption of new names. And while it is true that as a result of testimony obtained through the program, the head of every major crime family has been arrested, and while it is true that not a single protectee who has followed the rules has been physically harmed since its inception, Schur did admit that the psychological toll has been a cost too high for many protectees to bear. Friends and families have been splintered. Grandparents have been ripped away from their grandchildren, and at least once a child who had just learned to say their own name was told that they had to learn to embrace a new one. It is almost impossible to imagine what it must feel like to not only relocate, but to completely remake one's sense of self, which brings us to the story that we all read this morning. Having killed an Egyptian official, Moshe flees Pharaoh under the threat of death and ends up in the wilderness of Midian. He meets and marries Zipporah, takes a job shepherding sheep for her father, and the first thing that we're told about his post is Vayinhag et Hatzon achar hamidbar. He led the sheep to the edge of the desert. And this is our question. Why did Moshe lead the sheep to the edge of the desert? What about his decision to graze his flocks in a particular location warrants it being brought to our attention? What does this practice tell us about Moshe's state of mind or the kind of leader that he will become? And there are three answers to this question that I'd like to share with you today, starting with the Portuguese economist and exegete Don Isaac Abarbanel. Citing a series of other commentators, he presents the case that for Moshe it did not matter that he had made it to Midian and beyond the immediate reach of the Egyptian police, because in the ancient world, legal jurisdiction did not depend on regional dominion, but on imperial power, and there was nowhere on earth that Moshe could take refuge or claim asylum and escape the clutches of Egyptian capture. So for these commentators, Moshe's decision to shepherd at the edge of the desert is a result of his sheer terror. Despite his relocation, there was no witness protection, and he remained defenseless against detection and susceptible to arrest or detention and extradition and execution. So for the rest of his life, his days were to be defined by dread and trepidation. In the words of these commentators, Hayaholech bamidbar, he went into the desert, lihistater mibnei adam, to hide from people, shelo yiruhu, so that no one would identify him, v'yagia hadavar la'oznei Pharaoh, and notify Pharaoh. The Netziv, however, disagrees and sees Moshe's decision to shepherd at the very edge of the desert less as a product of defensive dread than as part of a proactive quest for heaven. For him, Moshe had let go of fear and made a clear break from his past. His mind was not occupied by an anxiety that his enemies might find him, but filled with a desire to find himself. So he went to the edge of the desert with his sheep so that they could eat, while he had the freedom to seek serenity in solitude and silence. In the words of the Netziv, Hayamish datel lanhig b'makom shu yoter midbar, he drove his sheep deep into the desert, kidei sheyuchal lehitboded, so that he could be isolated, v'lachkor achar alakut, and facilitate his meditation on matters of theology. Read this way, Moshe adapted to his relocation with ease and embraced a new lease on life, away from the noise and vice of imperial Egypt. From here on in, he could dedicate his time to contemplation and his desire to pursue truth in seclusion and aspire to the life of a committed mystic. But there is a third reading of Moshe's decision to wade through the wilderness and graze at the very edge of the desert. For the 15th century Alsatian sage Rabbi Yochanan Luria, author of the Meshivat Nefesh, Moshe neither lived in fear of arrest and death, nor in pursuit of solitude and truth. He fled to the edge of the desert out of an irrepressible sense of frustration and despair. For Rav Luria, Moshe always knew that by nature he could not tolerate or abide by vice. If he saw a slave being beaten or friends having a fight, he would almost involuntarily intervene. He was driven by a sense of fairness and integrity, defined by an uncompromising commitment to social justice and human dignity. And in the words of Rav Luria, Moshe was acutely self-aware. He kir ba'atzmo, he saw in himself, she'ef shalo lahalim ayin, the inability to cover his eyes, elhit apek, or to curb his desire, melaharshia et harasha, to indict the wicked. But his keen self-awareness had become complemented by an equally accurate assessment of the spirit of his age, an age disinclined toward the kind of enlightened sensibilities that defined Moshe's hopes. Through a series of unfortunate events, he had come to find that wider society, at least at the time, was not ready for his reproof. In the words of Rav Luria, Ein hador ra'ui letochacha, it was a generation ill-prepared for rebuke. So Moshe, a prince of Egypt, had stopped a slaughter and paused a brawl, but yet it was he who had become the outlaw. He was a man out of time, plagued by an innate indignation that had no place in his age, an instinct that failed to mitigate conflict or ameliorate rage. He had come to see that his disposition clashed with his reality, that in some ways his existence was destined to end in tragedy. So after he fled, he went to the edge of the desert, Achar HaMidbar, to abandon society and live out his years alone. Barach min hayeshuv, he fled settlements. V'nit moded bamidbar, and sequestered himself in the desert, she'ein dirat bnei adam sham, because it was uninhabited by humankind. And read this way, Moshe simply gave up in the face of repeated failure and left the stage of history in a state of despair. The very people that he sought to protect had rejected him. The very values that he fought to defend had no sway. So, betrayed by his nature, forsaken by his age, he withdrew and retreated to the edge of the desert where there was no injustice to fight, because there were no people. And it was in response to this retreat that heaven countered with the sight of a tireless fire and the summons to get back up and get back in the game. One of the most essential teachings of our tradition is embodied in a single sentence taught by a central and seminal sage. Lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. It is not our duty to finish the work. V'lo ata ven charin libatel mimena, but neither are we free to desist from it. We all face a range of reasons to give up on a whole host of hopes. There is always a shortage of time or interest or energy and a plethora of pretext for claiming an exemption. But we are called on to defy our own despair, deny our own desire, and to reignite the fire of our tireless cause. We are summoned, no matter the impediments, to do all we can to stay the course. So let us take today, Shabbat, as the haven that it is to breathe and bask in the peace of a weekly rest. But as sundown came, let us see in the fire that we light a sight that seeks to revitalize our vigor and resuscitate our mission to seek justice and advance peace, to heal and teach and unleash the vision of a world redeemed. Shavua Tov.